When Sarah's co-workers arranged her blind date with some guy from downtown, they snickered behind her back, convinced they were setting up their struggling single colleague for humiliation. Little did they know that the man waiting at the coffee shop was David Martinez, CEO of Martinez Industries, worth $300 million, who had been searching for someone real in a world full of pretense and superficiality. What began as a cruel office prank orchestrated by jealous colleagues would become the most genuine love story either had ever experienced, culminating in a proposal so unexpected and heartfelt it would leave an entire restaurant speechless and transform two broken, lonely hearts into something beautiful and whole. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Sarah Chen pulled her tired Honda into the hospital parking lot as the first rays of dawn painted the sky a soft pink, the same color as the faded scrubs she'd been wearing for 3 years. At 28, she had the gentle eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering but refused to let it harden her heart. Her small apartment, just 15 minutes from St. Mary's Hospital, bore the quiet dignity of someone making the most of very little, a single framed photo of her late father on the kitchen counter, her nursing school diploma hanging proudly beside a handwritten note from a grateful patient, and the soft sound of her mother's labored breathing drifting from the bedroom where she spent most of her days now. Sarah's hands, though calloused from years of caring for others, still trembled slightly as she applied her lip balm in the rearview mirror, a small ritual that reminded her she was still a woman with dreams beneath the exhaustion. Inside the hospital's fluorescent-lit break room, Monica Williams and Jessica Torres sat with their designer coffee cups, their perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table as they watched Sarah enter through the glass doors. Monica, whose husband was a successful attorney, had never understood why someone would choose to work double shifts when they could simply marry well, and Jessica, whose father owned 3 medical practices, viewed Sarah's struggles as a form of entertainment, a reminder of what happened to people who didn't make the right connections. They observed how Sarah always brought homemade sandwiches in reused containers, how she volunteered for the most difficult patients without complaint, and how she never joined their after-work gatherings at expensive restaurants. Not because she was antisocial, but because her mother needed her medications picked up and dinner prepared. What they mistook for weakness was actually a strength they would never possess. The ability to find joy in small moments, to offer comfort without expecting anything in return, and to maintain hope even when life seemed determined to test every ounce of resilience she possessed. Sarah hung her worn jacket in her locker, unaware that across the room 2 women were already plotting what they considered harmless fun. The whispers started during the morning shift change, when Dr. Patterson specifically requested Sarah for his most challenging patient, bypassing Monica despite her seniority, and they grew louder when old Mrs. Henderson refused to let anyone but Sarah change her bandages, gripping the young nurse's hand like a lifeline. Monica's jaw clenched as she watched through the glass partition, seeing how naturally Sarah moved through the ward, how patients' faces lit up when she entered their rooms, how even the most demanding doctors seemed to soften around her genuine compassion. Jessica felt the familiar burn of resentment as she observed Dr. Chen, no relation to Sarah, but sharing the same last name, asking Sarah's opinion about a treatment plan, something he had never done with Jessica despite her father's connections in the medical community. During their lunch break, while Sarah was in the cafeteria helping an elderly patient cut his food, Monica leaned across the break room table with a malicious gleam in her eyes that Jessica recognized immediately. They had bonded over their shared frustration with Sarah's inexplicable popularity, convincing themselves that someone so naive and trusting deserved whatever cruel lesson life might teach her. Monica pulled out her phone and began typing, her fingers dancing across the screen as she created a fake dating profile using a photo she had secretly taken of Sarah during the hospital's Christmas party, when Sarah had worn her one good dress and looked almost radiant despite her obvious exhaustion. Jessica giggled as Monica crafted a bio that portrayed Sarah as desperate and overeager, then scrolled through random men's profiles until she found someone who looked either completely uninteresting or potentially unstable. The plan was beautifully simple in its cruelty: arrange a blind date through the app, tell Sarah that a mutual friend had set it up, and then sit back and watch as she either got stood up or endured an evening with someone completely inappropriate, giving them weeks of entertainment and ammunition to use against her. They pictured Sarah waiting alone at some coffee shop, checking her phone repeatedly, her face flushing with embarrassment as the minutes ticked by and no one appeared, finally understanding that she was not as special as everyone seemed to think she was. What Monica and Jessica could never have imagined, as they snickered over their phones and planned their victim's humiliation, was that their petty jealousy was about to set in motion the most extraordinary love story, one that would make their own carefully constructed lives seem hollow and meaningless by comparison. David Martinez stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city pulse with life far below, while feeling more isolated than ever, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. A man who commanded boardrooms and built empires but couldn't fill the hollow ache that had taken residence in his chest 3 years ago. The mahogany desk behind him bore the weight of contracts worth millions, but his eyes always drifted to the small framed photo tucked beside his computer monitor, Emma's radiant smile from their last vacation together, before the cancer diagnosis that would steal her away piece by piece, leaving him to raise their daughter Lily alone in a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. At 35, David had everything society claimed a man should want: wealth beyond measure, respect from his peers, a company that bore his family name and employed thousands. Yet he went to bed each night in a king-sized bed that felt like an ocean of loneliness, waking to Lily's innocent questions about why Daddy looked so sad even when he smiled. His assistant, Margaret, knocked softly on the glass door, her kind eyes holding the gentle persistence of someone who had watched him slowly disappear into his work over the past 3 years, using 18-hour days as a shield against grief that never seemed to lessen. She mentioned the call from Rebecca, Emma's best friend since college, who had been quietly orchestrating what she called Operation Daddy Needs Someone for the past 6 months, insisting that Emma would want him to find love again, to show Lily what a complete family looked like. David's first instinct was to refuse, as he had refused every previous attempt, but Margaret's words echoed something Emma had whispered to him during one of her final lucid moments in the hospital, that love wasn't meant to die with the beloved, that Lily deserved to see her father truly happy again. The date was arranged for Saturday evening at a small coffee shop downtown, somewhere anonymous and safe, where he could escape if necessary, though the very thought of sitting across from a stranger and pretending to care about her favorite movies or career ambitions felt like a betrayal of everything he and Emma had built together. Yet as he looked at Lily's latest drawing taped to his office wall, a stick-figure family with a conspicuous gap where a mother should be, David Martinez, CEO and widowed father, made a decision that would change everything. Sarah stood before her mother's antique mirror, the one piece of furniture that had survived 3 apartment moves and countless financial struggles. Her hands trembling as she applied the lipstick she had been saving for a special occasion, though she couldn't quite believe this qualified as one. Her mother, Helen, sat propped up in her favorite chair, oxygen tank humming softly beside her, but her eyes sparkled with the same mischievous joy that had once made her the belle of every dance in her small hometown 50 years ago, insisting that Sarah wear the navy blue dress that had belonged to her neighbor's daughter, a simple but elegant piece that hugged Sarah's modest figure in all the right places. Helen had spent the afternoon helping Sarah curl her hair with an old set of hot rollers, sharing stories of her own first dates with Sarah's father, reminding her daughter that love had a way of finding people when they least expected it, even when they felt unworthy of it. Sarah checked her reflection one last time, grabbed her small purse with exactly enough money for coffee and a bus ride home, and kissed her mother's forehead before stepping into the cool evening air, her heart hammering as she walked to the bus stop 3 blocks away, wondering what kind of man would agree to a blind date with someone he had never met. Meanwhile, across the city in his private garage, David Martinez stood before his collection of luxury vehicles, the Bentley, the Tesla, the vintage Porsche, and deliberately selected his oldest car, a modest Honda Civic he had bought in college and kept for sentimental reasons, running his hands through his hair as he tried to calm nerves he hadn't felt since he was a teenager, asking Emma to prom. He had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that Emma used to say brought out his eyes. Leaving behind his expensive watches, his tailored suits, anything that might scream wealth and attract the wrong kind of attention from someone who might see dollar signs instead of the broken man beneath. As David pulled out of his gated community and Sarah settled into a worn bus seat, both were traveling toward the same destination with the same mixture of hope and terror, neither knowing that fate had orchestrated this meeting through the cruelest of circumstances, and that their two worlds, so different in material wealth but so similar in loneliness, were about to collide in the most beautiful way imaginable. The little coffee shop on 5th Street had the kind of worn charm that spoke of countless first meetings and quiet conversations, in its mismatched furniture and soft jazz, creating an atmosphere where strangers could become something more. Though neither Sarah nor David believed such magic was possible for them as they each arrived 20 minutes early, driven by the same mixture of anxiety and desperate hope, David chose a corner table where he could observe the entrance. His hands wrapped around a black coffee he couldn't taste, watching every woman who walked through the door with the cynical eye of someone who had learned to spot manipulation from across a room, expecting to see the familiar hunger in someone's gaze when they realized who he was and what he could provide. Sarah entered like a whisper of spring rain, her borrowed dress catching the warm light from the window, her fingers nervously adjusting her purse strap as she approached the counter where a tired-looking barista with multiple piercings and a name tag reading Marcus was clearly having a difficult evening. David watched, transfixed, as Sarah asked Marcus about his day with genuine interest, listened to his complaints about difficult customers with the same compassion she showed her patients, and left a tip that was probably too generous for her budget, but exactly right for her heart, her smile lighting up the young man's face in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being seen as human. When Sarah finally looked around the coffee shop, her eyes found David's immediately, and something passed between them that neither had expected, a recognition not of faces, but of souls that had been carrying the same weight of loneliness for far too long. David rose from his table, noting how Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress, how her smile was nervous but real, how she looked at him not with the calculating assessment he had grown to expect from women, but with the same hopeful vulnerability he felt reflecting in his own chest. Sarah saw a man whose expensive haircut couldn't hide the exhaustion in his dark eyes, whose simple sweater and jeans spoke of someone trying to blend in rather than stand out, whose tentative smile suggested he was as unsure about this meeting as she was. And in that moment of mutual uncertainty, something beautiful began to bloom in the space between two hearts that had forgotten how to hope for love. The conversation began tentatively, like two people testing the temperature of unfamiliar water. But within minutes they found themselves leaning forward across the small table, drawn into each other's words with a magnetic pull neither had experienced in years. Sarah found herself sharing stories from the hospital, not the dramatic medical emergencies that made for good television, but the quiet moments of human connection that made her job meaningful, like the elderly man who taught her to play chess during his long recovery, or the young mother who named her newborn daughter after Sarah because she had held her hand through the scariest night of her life. David listened with an intensity that made Sarah's cheeks flush, his questions revealing a depth of empathy that surprised her. And when she asked about his work, he spoke carefully about management challenges and difficult decisions that affect a lot of people, painting himself as someone in middle management rather than the boardroom, his words carrying the weight of genuine stress without revealing the scope of his responsibilities. They discovered shared loves of old movies and quiet Sunday mornings, laughed about their mutual inability to keep houseplants alive, and found themselves finishing each other's thoughts in a way that felt both startling and perfectly natural. When David mentioned Lily almost in passing, talking about how his weekends were usually spent at playgrounds and Disney movies rather than bars and dating apps, Sarah's entire face transformed, her eyes lighting up with a joy so pure it took his breath away. And she began asking gentle questions about his daughter's favorite activities, her school, whether she liked to read, questions that came from genuine interest rather than the calculating assessment of a woman wondering how much child support might be involved. David found himself sharing more about Lily than he had with anyone outside family, describing her fierce independence and her habit of leaving encouraging notes in his briefcase, watching Sarah's expressions shift between delight and tender understanding in a way that made his chest tighten with an emotion he had almost forgotten existed. Neither mentioned money or possessions, neither dropped hints about their living situations or social circles. And in that careful omission, they created a space where their souls could meet without the complications of their vastly different worlds, falling into a connection so natural and unexpected that both began to believe, for the first time in years, that maybe love was still possible after all. As the coffee shop began to fill with the dinner crowd, David found himself reluctant to let the evening end, his words tumbling out before he could stop them as he asked if Sarah might like to take a walk, and her immediate yes sent a warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with the caffeine and everything to do with the way she looked at him like he was someone worth spending time with rather than someone to be endured. They stepped into the golden hour light that painted the city in shades of amber and rose, walking slowly toward Riverside Park, where the evening air carried the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant sound of a saxophone drifting from somewhere near the fountain. Sarah stopped suddenly when they encountered a young street musician playing guitar with his case open for donations, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy David hadn't seen since Lily discovered butterflies in their garden, and she listened to the entire song with her eyes closed, swaying slightly to the melody, before dropping a few crumpled bills into his case, despite David's gentle protest that she didn't need to do that. When they reached the park's overlook, where the setting sun turned the river into liquid gold, Sarah gasped with genuine wonder, her hand instinctively reaching for David's arm as she whispered that she never got to see sunsets like this from her neighborhood. And David found himself studying her profile more than the scenery, charmed beyond words by someone who could find such beauty in a moment. Most people would scroll past on their phones. Throughout their leisurely walk, Sarah was amazed by David's thoughtful questions, not the surface-level inquiries about her favorite color or what she did for fun, but deeper wonderings about what made her choose nursing. Whether she ever felt overwhelmed by carrying so much of other people's pain, how she maintained such optimism when her work exposed her to life's hardest moments daily. His genuine interest in her answers, the way he remembered details from earlier in their conversation and built upon them, the gentle way he encouraged her to share more when she grew self-conscious about talking too much, made Sarah feel truly seen for the first time in years, like someone had finally looked past her circumstances and found something worthy of curiosity and care. As they walked back toward the coffee shop where their cars were parked, both David and Sarah were quietly marveling at how natural this felt, how a blind date that had begun with nervous small talk had evolved into something that felt remarkably like coming home. 3 dates later, when David's usual babysitter canceled last minute, and he faced the choice between disappointing Sarah or introducing her to the most important person in his world, his heart made the decision before his head could interfere. His voice slightly nervous as he called to ask if she might be interested in meeting Lily over pizza and homework instead of their planned dinner out. Sarah's immediate enthusiasm, the way she asked what toppings Lily preferred, and whether she might need help with any particular subjects, told David everything he needed to know about the woman who was slowly but surely stealing his heart. He had chosen his modest 2-bedroom apartment in a middle-class neighborhood specifically for moments like this. A place where he could exist as simply David the father rather than David Martinez the CEO, where takeout pizza boxes and children's artwork on the refrigerator told a different story than the marble and crystal of his main residence. When Sarah arrived with a small bag of art supplies she had picked up on the way, explaining shyly that she always found children responded better to homework when they could make it colorful, 7-year-old Lily took one look at this gentle stranger and declared her way prettier than Daddy's friend, Rebecca said, immediately dragging Sarah to the kitchen table where her math worksheets lay, abandoned like tiny monuments to frustration. David watched from the doorway, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name, as Sarah settled beside his daughter and began turning multiplication tables into a story about magical unicorns who collected rainbow numbers. Her patience infinite as Lily struggled with the problems, her praise genuine when breakthrough moments arrived, her laughter musical as Lily shared elaborate stories about her classmates and her pet goldfish, named Sir Bubbles. Over dinner, Sarah helped Lily cut her pizza into manageable bites, listened with rapt attention to a detailed explanation of the social dynamics of second grade, and answered Lily's endless questions about being a nurse, with the same respect she would show an adult, never once talking down or dismissing the child's curiosity. As Sarah tucked a napkin under Lily's chin and praised her for finishing her vegetables, David felt something shift permanently in his chest, watching this woman, who he assumed was struggling to make ends meet, give so freely of her time and attention to a child she barely knew, never realizing that her natural grace with Lily was stealing his heart completely. 2 weeks later, when David mentioned never having met anyone's family before a slip that revealed more about his isolated world than he intended, Sarah found herself extending an invitation she had never offered to any man, her voice soft as she asked if he might like to have dinner with her and her mother, warning him gently that Helen could be a bit overwhelming with her questions, but that she had been asking about the young man who makes Sarah smile like that. David arrived at Sarah's modest apartment carrying flowers, for both women and a children's book, for Lily's next visit. His heart clenching as he took in the worn but spotless surroundings, furniture that had seen better decades but was arranged with care, medical equipment discreetly positioned near the couch, where Helen Chen held court like a benevolent queen, despite her obvious frailty. Helen's eyes sparkled with mischief as she studied David over her oxygen mask, her questions direct and unfiltered in the way of someone who had lived through enough to cut straight to what mattered, asking him about his intentions toward her daughter. Whether he understood how precious Sarah was, and if he had enough sense to appreciate what he had found. David found himself charmed by Helen's sharp wit and protective fierce love. The way she teased Sarah about her inability to cook anything more complex than scrambled eggs, how she shared embarrassing childhood stories with the gleeful abandon of a mother who had earned the right to embarrass her grown child, all while Sarah blushed and protested from the kitchen where she was attempting to salvage their dinner. As the evening progressed and David witnessed Sarah's tender care adjusting Helen's pillows, checking her medications, helping her to the bathroom with dignity intact, he was overwhelmed by the devotion this young woman showed, the way she anticipated her mother's needs without being asked, her infinite patience when Helen's illness made her irritable or forgetful, when Helen excused herself for an early bedtime. David noticed the stack of medical bills on the counter, the careful budgeting notes in Sarah's handwriting, and his heart broke for this woman who was giving everything she had to care for someone she loved, leading him to offer quietly to help with expenses, to ease some of the burden he could see weighing on her shoulders. Sarah's gentle but firm refusal, her insistence that they were managing just fine, and her obvious discomfort at the suggestion, made David respect her even more, while simultaneously frustrating his desire to fix everything for someone who had already given him so much joy. Over the following weeks, their relationship settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. With David finding excuses to leave work early for the first time in 3 years, his assistant Margaret commenting with barely concealed delight that he was actually whistling in the elevator, something she hadn't heard since before Emma's diagnosis. Sarah began taking extra care with her appearance, borrowing lip gloss from her coworker Jenny, and splurging on a new sweater that brought out the green in her eyes, her mother teasing that she moved through their tiny apartment like she was dancing to music only she could hear, humming while she prepared meals and smiling at nothing in particular. Their dates became a carefully choreographed dance around their real lives. David would pick her up in his modest Honda, while his driver waited with the Bentley several blocks away, while Sarah would meet him wearing borrowed jewelry and her single pair of good shoes, both maintaining their gentle deceptions to protect the fragile magic growing between them. They discovered a shared love of old bookstores and quiet museum corners, spent Saturday afternoons at playgrounds where Lily could run free while they talked about everything and nothing, their hands finding each other with increasing frequency as they walked. Small touches that sent electricity through both their carefully guarded hearts. David found himself sharing memories of Emma without the usual crushing weight of grief, telling Sarah stories about his late wife's terrible cooking and her habit of singing off-key in the shower, surprised to find that love could expand rather than replace, that his heart was large enough to hold both his cherished past and his hopeful future. Sarah opened up about her dreams, deferred the master's degree she had planned before her father's death. The travel she had always imagined, the children she sometimes wondered if she would ever have. And David listened with the intensity of someone storing away every word like precious treasures, already imagining ways he could help make those dreams reality if she would let him. Yet beneath their growing intimacy lay currents of fear neither dared to voice. David terrified that Sarah would see his wealth as a burden or change how she treated him. Sarah convinced that her modest circumstances made her unworthy of someone who seemed so put together and kind. Both dancing around the word love that hung unspoken between them like a bridge they were afraid to cross, not knowing that their hesitation was protecting something infinitely more precious than either had dared to hope for. David sat in his executive boardroom during what should have been a routine quarterly meeting, watching his colleagues discuss merger opportunities and market projections, while his mind wandered to the way Sarah had laughed at Lily's joke about goldfish the night before, her genuine delight so different from the calculated responses he encountered in his usual social circles. The disconnect between his two worlds had never felt sharper than when Marcus Wellington, his oldest business associate, mentioned his latest conquest, a model whose main qualification seemed to be her ability to look stunning at charity galas, while David found himself thinking about Sarah's gentle hands changing her mother's bandages and her quiet strength, more beautiful than any runway pose. He could already imagine the raised eyebrows and barely concealed sneers if he brought Sarah to the annual Martinez Industries Gala, could hear the whispered comments about gold diggers and social climbers from people who had never worked a double shift or chosen between medication and groceries, people who measured worth in stock portfolios rather than kindness. Yet, as David drove home through the city streets, Emma's voice seemed to whisper through his memory with the same fierce clarity she had possessed in life, reminding him that she had fallen in love with him when he was nobody special. Just a young man with big dreams and calloused hands from his construction job, that real love wasn't about matching bank accounts or social standing, but about souls recognizing their other half across any divide. Emma's imagined words grew stronger as he tucked Lily into bed and listened to her chatter about Sarah's promise to teach her how to braid friendship bracelets, his daughter's innocent acceptance of this woman who made her father smile again, serving as the clearest possible guidance about what mattered most. That night, David sat at his desk in his home office, surrounded by the trappings of his success awards and photographs with politicians, certificates of achievement that had once defined his identity, and began drafting the words he would use to tell Sarah the truth about who he really was, knowing that this conversation would either destroy the most genuine relationship he had found since Emma's death, or become the foundation for a love story that transcended every barrier his wealth and status had created around his heart. The whispers in the hospital break room had grown more pointed over the past month, with Monica and Jessica watching Sarah like predators who had lost sight of their wounded prey, their carefully orchestrated prank having backfired in ways they couldn't understand or accept. Monica's perfectly manicured nails drummed against her coffee cup as she studied Sarah's face for cracks in what she assumed was an elaborate act, convinced that no man could possibly be interested in someone who wore the same 3 pairs of scrubs and brought homemade lunches in recycled containers. Yet here was Sarah glowing with a happiness that seemed to radiate from her very core. Jessica's frustration mounted each time she casually asked about Sarah's mystery boyfriend, expecting to hear stories of disappointment and rejection that would validate their cruel joke, instead finding herself faced with Sarah's gentle smile and carefully vague responses about someone special who made her feel valued and heard. When Monica pressed for details, where did he work? What did he drive? Had he met her mother yet? Sarah would deflect with the same gracious privacy that protected her patient's dignity, speaking about David's kindness and his daughter's sweet nature, without revealing anything that might expose him to their judgment or gossip. The more protective Sarah became of her relationship's details, the more convinced Monica and Jessica grew that she was hiding something embarrassing, perhaps dating someone far beneath her already modest standards, and they began making increasingly cutting comments about desperation and settling for less than one deserved. Sarah endured their mockery with the same quiet strength that carried her through difficult shifts and her mother's bad days, refusing to let their poison seep into the pure joy she felt. Every time David texted her during his lunch break, or when Lily drew her pictures to hang on Helen's refrigerator, knowing that some treasures were too precious to be shared with people who wouldn't understand their value. What Monica and Jessica couldn't comprehend, as they congratulated themselves on their superior taste in men and their ability to spot desperation from across a room, was that their petty cruelty had inadvertently created the most genuine love story either Sarah or David had ever experienced, and that their victim's quiet happiness was about to become the foundation for a fairy tale that would make their own carefully constructed lives seem hollow and meaningless by comparison. David spent hours selecting the perfect restaurant for what he hoped would be the most important conversation of his life. Choosing Romano's not for its Michelin stars or exclusive clientele, but because Emma had always said it felt like being welcomed into someone's home, with its warm lighting and intimate booths that encouraged quiet confessions and life-changing declarations. He rehearsed his words during board meetings and conference calls, practicing how to explain that he had hidden his wealth not from shame, but from fear, that every woman since Emma's death had seen his money before they saw his heart, and that Sarah's love felt pure precisely because it existed without knowledge of his fortune, making it more precious than any treasure he had accumulated in his corporate kingdom. Meanwhile, Sarah hummed softly as she organized medication schedules for her mother, her phone buzzing with David's sweet text about their dinner plans. Completely unaware that across the hospital, Monica and Jessica were finally getting the entertainment they had orchestrated months ago. Though not in the way they had expected, Sarah had been heading to the break room for her afternoon coffee when she heard their familiar voices drifting through the partially open door, Monica's laugh sharp with malicious delight as she recounted their brilliant prank to a group of newer nurses. Describing how they had created the fake dating profile and arranged the blind date, expecting Sarah to come back humiliated and defeated, only to watch her bloom into insufferable happiness instead. Jessica's voice joined in with cruel satisfaction, speculating that whoever had shown up for the date must be playing an elaborate long game, probably planning to string Sarah along until he got bored or found someone better, because what kind of decent man would actually fall for their pathetic colleague with her thrift store clothes and her sad little life caring for an invalid mother? Sarah's coffee cup slipped from her trembling fingers, the sound of ceramic shattering against the linoleum floor echoing the destruction happening inside her chest as she realized that everything, every tender moment, every gentle kiss, every time David had made her feel worthy of love, had been built on the foundation of a cruel joke, and that the man who had become her entire world must have been laughing at her gullible heart from the very beginning. Sarah arrived at Romano's 30 minutes early, her heart encased in ice as she chose a corner booth where she could control the conversation and make her escape quickly, her borrowed dress feeling like a costume now that she understood she had been playing a role in someone else's cruel theater. Every memory of David's kindness reframed as pity or worse, elaborate performance art designed to humiliate her in ways she was still discovering. When David walked through the restaurant's entrance carrying white roses and wearing the nervous smile of a man about to bare his soul, Sarah felt her carefully constructed armor crack slightly before she reinforced it with every ounce of dignity she possessed, watching him scan the room until his eyes found hers and lit up with the same joy that had once made her believe in fairy tales. David slid into the booth across from her, the flowers between them like a bridge he hoped to cross, his words tumbling out about how beautiful she looked and how he had been thinking about this evening all day. But Sarah's cold silence and the way she sat rigidly against the booth's back made his enthusiasm falter, replaced by growing concern as he searched her face for clues about what had changed since their last perfect afternoon together. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was steady but brittle as glass, telling him she knew about the prank, that she had discovered how her co-workers had set up the fake dating profile and arranged their meeting as entertainment, and that she didn't need his pity or whatever twisted game he was playing by pretending to care about someone so beneath his notice. David's confusion was so genuine and complete that Sarah almost believed it. Watching his face cycle through bewilderment, realization, and something that looked remarkably like heartbreak as he reached across the table for her hands. His voice urgent as he swore he had no knowledge of any prank, that Rebecca had arranged their date through completely different means, that everything between them was real and precious, and had nothing to do with her co-worker's cruelty. The roses lay forgotten between them, as other diners began to notice the drama unfolding in the corner booth. Two people who loved each other desperately, but were speaking different languages of pain, neither understanding that they were both victims of the same cosmic joke that had brought them together through malice, but bound them with something far more powerful than either had dared to hope for. The restaurant's gentle murmur of conversation gradually died as David's voice rose in desperation, his hands reaching across the table only to have Sarah pull back as if his touch burned, her eyes bright with unshed tears, as she recounted in precise, devastating detail what she had overheard Monica and Jessica laughing about: the fake dating profile, a cruel bet about how long it would take to break her heart, the way they had described her as pathetic and desperate, someone whose humiliation would provide weeks of entertainment. Other diners turned in their chairs to watch this private drama unfold, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable recognition of witnessing something too intimate for public consumption, as David's face went pale with horror at the realization that someone had weaponized Sarah's trusting heart for sport, his voice breaking as he swore repeatedly that he had never heard of Monica or Jessica, that Rebecca had arranged their meeting through completely different channels, that everything between them was sacred and real. Sarah's composure finally cracked as she whispered how foolish she felt for believing someone like him could actually care about someone like her. A woman who worked double shifts and lived paycheck to paycheck, whose biggest luxury was the occasional coffee with a man who was clearly too good to be true. And that's when David's own careful facade crumbled completely. Through his tears, he began telling her the truth he had planned to reveal so differently, that he wasn't the middle manager she thought he was, that his full name was David Martinez of Martinez Industries, that he had hidden his wealth because every relationship since Emma's death had been poisoned by people who wanted his money rather than his heart, that he had fallen in love with her precisely because she had loved him without knowing he was worth $300 million. The chaos of dual revelations hit them both like a physical blow. Sarah, staring at this man she thought she knew, realizing he was a stranger who had been lying to her for months, while David watched the woman he adored process the magnitude of the deception he had maintained, even as he proclaimed his honesty, both understanding simultaneously that neither had been living in reality, that their entire relationship existed in a space between two enormous lies that had just collapsed around them like a house of cards. The silence between them stretched like a chasm, as Sarah searched David's eyes and found only raw honesty staring back at her, the kind of transparent pain that couldn't be faked or performed, and slowly the ice around her heart began to crack as she realized this man, this wealthy, powerful man, who could have anyone had chosen to love her when he thought she was nobody special, had treasured their simple dates and quiet moments. Not because he was slumming, but because he had found something real in a world full of pretense. David saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in Sarah's expression, watched her process that his deception had come from the same place as her own protective instincts, that they had both been hiding their true selves out of fear of being rejected for who they really were. And his heart broke all over again as he witnessed the confusion and hurt warring with love across her beautiful face. The restaurant had grown completely quiet around them, their private drama having become unintentional dinner theater. But David barely noticed until he caught sight of two women at a table near the window, their phones pointed in their direction and their faces wearing expressions of malicious glee that made his blood run cold with recognition. These had to be the colleagues who had orchestrated Sarah's humiliation, who had followed her here to witness what they expected to be the final act of their cruel joke. In that moment, as Sarah sat before him broken and beautiful and afraid to trust the love that had transformed both their lives, as her tormentors watched with anticipation for her complete destruction, as an entire restaurant full of strangers waited to see how this real-life drama would unfold, David Martinez made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He slid from the booth and dropped to one knee beside their table, his voice carrying across the suddenly electric silence as he spoke, not to the crowd but to the only person who mattered, the woman whose love had taught him that wealth without heart was worthless, that genuine connection was the only treasure worth pursuing, and that sometimes the most profound love stories began with the cruelest pranks, but ended with the most beautiful truth imaginable. David's knees hit the cold restaurant floor without conscious thought, his hands reaching for Sarah's trembling fingers as every carefully planned speech he had rehearsed evaporated, replaced by words that came straight from the deepest chambers of his heart, raw and unpolished, and more real than anything he had ever said in any boardroom or business meeting. His voice carried across the hushed restaurant as he told her that he didn't have a ring because this wasn't planned, that he was proposing not because it was the right time or the right place, but because the thought of losing her was more terrifying than any corporate crisis he had ever faced, that her love had awakened parts of his soul that had been sleeping since Emma died, and he couldn't bear to let them go dark again. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as David spoke about how Emma used to tell him that love multiplies rather than divides, that there was room in his heart for both his cherished memories and his hopeful future, and he knew with absolute certainty that Emma would have loved Sarah's gentle strength and fierce devotion, would have trusted her completely with Lily's tender heart and his own fragile hope for happiness. Through tears that he made no attempt to hide, David told Sarah that he didn't need her to love his money or his status, or the life his wealth could provide. He needed her to love him the way she already had, completely and honestly, the way she loved her mother and his daughter, and every patient who found comfort in her caring hands. His voice broke as he asked her, not just to marry him, but to be Lily's mother, to help him build a family that was grounded in genuine connection rather than social expectation, to show him every day what it meant to choose love over fear, kindness over cynicism, hope over the safer option of keeping their hearts locked away. Across the room, Monica and Jessica watched in stunned horror as their victim became the center of the most romantic proposal anyone in the restaurant had ever witnessed, and their cruel prank having backfired so spectacularly that they could only stare as David Martinez, one of the city's most eligible bachelors, poured his heart out to the woman they had dismissed as worthless, proving that real love sees treasures invisible to shallow eyes, and that sometimes the cruelest jokes become the most beautiful love stories. Sarah's tears fell freely as she looked into David's eyes and saw not the wealthy CEO who commanded boardrooms and built empires, but the gentle father who read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, the man who remembered how she liked her coffee and asked about her mother's health every single day, the soul who had loved her when he thought she was nobody special and somehow loved her even more now that all their truths lay scattered between them, like broken glass that could still catch the light beautifully. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the silent restaurant as she said, yes. Not to his fortune or his status or the life of luxury he could provide, but to his heart that had found room for both grief and new love. To his kindness that extended to elderly patients and overworked baristas, to the way he made her feel worthy of something extraordinary even when she felt most ordinary. The restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause, strangers wiping tears from their own eyes as they witnessed something rare and precious in a world that often seemed cynical and cold, their collective joy creating a symphony of celebration that made even the waitstaff pause in their duties to watch this real-life fairy tale unfold before them. Across the room, Monica and Jessica sat frozen in horror as their carefully orchestrated humiliation transformed into the most romantic moment anyone present would ever witness, their cruel prank having backfired so completely that they could only watch as David Martinez swept Sarah into his arms and kissed her with the passion of a man who had found his soulmate in the most unexpected place, their victim, now the center of a love story that would make headlines and break their petty hearts with its pure authenticity. The photographers who had been dining quietly after covering a nearby charity gala began snapping pictures almost instinctively, capturing the moment when David lifted Sarah off her feet and spun her around while she laughed through her tears. The image of their joy so radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire restaurant, creating a moment of magic that would soon be shared around the world, as proof that genuine love could still triumph over cruelty. That sometimes the most beautiful endings began with the most painful pranks, and that two broken hearts could indeed become something infinitely more beautiful when they chose to trust love over fear. Within hours, the photograph of David lifting Sarah off her feet in Romano's restaurant had spread across social media like wildfire, the caption reading, "CEO's romantic proposal stops traffic at downtown restaurant," accompanied by breathless articles about the Martinez Industries billionaire who had found love with a humble hospital nurse, their story becoming the kind of viral sensation that restored people's faith in authentic romance. Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications as her colleagues at St. Mary's Hospital discovered that their quiet, struggling co-worker was now engaged to one of the city's most powerful men, the same woman they had dismissed as pathetic and desperate, suddenly revealed as the star of the most enviable love story any of them had ever witnessed. Monica and Jessica watched their phones in growing horror as the story spread, realizing that their names were being mentioned in comment threads and gossip forums as the cruel colleagues who had orchestrated the prank that accidentally created this fairy tale romance, their reputations crumbling as people expressed disgust at their heartless attempt to humiliate someone whose only crime was being kind and trusting. Hospital administration, faced with a public relations nightmare as patients and donors saw the viral story and learned that two of their employees had bullied the woman, now being celebrated as a real-life Cinderella, began conducting a formal investigation that would ultimately result in both women facing disciplinary action and the kind of professional consequences that would follow them for years to come. Meanwhile, David and Sarah sat in his modest apartment with Lily between them on the couch. All three of them scrolling through the endless stream of comments and reactions, their laughter mixing with disbelief as they processed the absurdity of how a cruel prank had become the foundation for their love story, with Sarah shaking her head in wonder as she read messages from strangers around the world who were inspired by their unexpected romance. David pulled both his girls closer as they watched the view count climb into the millions, marveling at how the universe had used the worst intentions of petty people to create something beautiful, their joy infectious. As they realized that what had begun as someone else's attempt to break Sarah's heart had instead given them both the greatest gift either could have imagined, a love so genuine it could withstand any revelation, any obstacle, any amount of public scrutiny or private doubt. 6 months later, the small chapel overlooking the harbor was filled not with the hundreds of business associates and society figures David could have invited, but with the people who truly mattered: Sarah's nursing colleagues who had supported her through the aftermath of Monica and Jessica's disgrace, David's employees who had watched their CEO transform from a driven workaholic into a man who left the office at 5:30 to help with homework and bedtime stories, and the handful of family members whose presence made the intimate ceremony feel complete and sacred. Lily walked down the aisle with the serious concentration of a 7-year-old given an important job, her basket of rose petals scattered with mathematical precision, while her face beamed with the joy of someone who finally had the mother she had been secretly wishing for in her nighttime prayers. Sarah's mother, Helen, sat in the front row, her oxygen tank discreetly hidden beneath a cascade of white flowers, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude as she watched her daughter marry not just a good man, but one whose wealth had quietly transformed their lives in ways that mattered most. The best doctors, the most comfortable medical equipment, the peace of mind that came from knowing Sarah no longer had to choose between caring for her mother and providing for their future. David's voice shook as he promised to love Sarah through every season of their lives, to build a family where kindness mattered more than status, where Lily would grow up understanding that true worth came from the size of one's heart rather than one's bank account, and Sarah's response was equally heartfelt as she vowed to love not just him, but the daughter who had already claimed a permanent place in her affections. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Sarah carrying Lily on her hip while David supported Helen's arm, they looked like what they had become, a family stitched together by love that had survived every test, every revelation, every moment of doubt that had threatened to tear them apart. The final photograph of their wedding day showed them in David's garden at sunset, Sarah's head on his shoulder while Lily chased fireflies around their feet, and Helen dozed peacefully in her chair nearby, a perfect portrait of how the cruelest pranks could sometimes lead to the most beautiful endings, and how genuine love could indeed transcend any circumstance when two hearts chose to trust in something larger than their fears.